Yeah, people are starting to stream in. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait a couple minutes as everyone gets in, and then we will get started. Just going to give everybody a minute to get started. I already have 50 participant attendees, so that's really great. But I think this is a good time to start. Hi, I'm Amanda Bickerstaff. I'm the CEO of Pivot Professional Learning, and I'm here today with Richard Wilson, the CEO of Math Pathways. We're really excited to have you here today with us and appreciate you spending your valuable time with us around the importance of feedback in the classroom and how to do that at the most effective way possible. So what we're going to do today is a little bit of a mix. We're gonna have a couple of discussions. We're going to have some really deep dives into targeted feedback and more longitudinal feedback. And then we're going to end on a challenge of how to take this back to your school in whatever context you're in. So we're going to get started. First of all, say hello to your fellow attendees. If you can, you have your chat function. It would be really great if you put in your name, where you're from, and your role within your school. Also, if you have any questions for us at any time, please use the Q&A function to ask that question. We will have a moderated Q&A at the end of the session. And so please use that as much as possible. We want you to have, we want you to learn from this. Both Richard and I believe very strongly as former educators that professional learning only matters if you have something to take away. And so we want this to be meaningful for you and your context. We'll do our best to be broad and targeted at the same time. It's really up to you also to ask those questions that can help you out. So we're going to get started with a question. So our question is, why are we even here today? So why is feedback important? Richard and I are both coming from very similar backgrounds in the sense that I'm American, shocker, in case you couldn't tell from my beautiful Australian accent that I have. But I'm a former science teacher and Richard's a former math teacher, which means we really like data, which you guys will definitely see. We're definitely on the data nerd spectrum, but we're going to have this discussion about from the perspective of a really kind of continuum of we've been teachers and now we are ed tech leaders. What is so important about feedback? So I'm going to throw it to you, Richard, to get started.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Just for context, I'm currently in not quite so sunny anymore Melbourne. It got gloomy this afternoon, but we are, hello to fellow Melburnians who are also celebrating officially coming out of lockdown in the last couple of days. And we are very keen to join the rest of the country and be feeling a bit happier. So that's nice. Hope you're all safe and well. So as Amanda said, I started my most recent pre-maths pathway career as a teacher. And like most kind of beginning teachers, I had a mix of mentors and I was really lucky to get some good kind of guidance as a teacher. But one of the things that I felt, to be frank, in my experience was missing was that feedback. I spent a lot of time locked in my own classroom teaching, wondering if I was doing a good job. And I think for me, the biggest question was I actually didn't know at the end of the day whether I taught well. I mean, my kids liked me, people laughed, some people got detention. And it was kind of difficult without their detail to say, well, what am I actually doing well? What should I be doing next? And Maths Pathway itself started in the classroom. It was the work of my co-founder and I while we were still teachers. And one of the things that's really guided us really from that very first day is the idea of feedback in creating the work that we do with teachers. So at Maths Pathway, we work with teachers every day. We like to think we've created one of the best ways of teaching maths in the world. But to be honest, we can't do that without trying it out with teachers and students in classrooms and then finding out from those teachers, how does it work, right? So we build a thing as an organization, we give it to teachers and we say, well, does it work for you? What doesn't work? And really, we've built most of what we do with the feedback of teachers, with the feedback of students in that kind of process. And to be honest, one of my biggest bugbears, I almost wince when Amanda says we're in ed tech, because the phrase makes me a bit itchy, because I think there are a lot of ed tech organizations and kind of products that they sit in an office with a bunch of software developers and maybe the occasional teacher and say, look, yeah, we built a tool, good luck. And that to me is not, that's not how you help. That's not how you work in education, because it has no feedback. You're doing it in isolation. So, I think both personally, both professionally, and in the work that we do, to me, feedback is central to teaching, but it's also central to working in education in any form.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that. So, Richard, I had a different experience. I taught in the Bronx. I was a high school biology teacher in the Bronx in a very marginalized community, and I was not a good teacher. I did not do well. If I got laughed at, it was because people felt bad for me at the beginning. And I was on an island. I was a new teacher. I was on an island. I was observed barely a handful of times my entire first year, and I knew I was ineffective. And that was something that was a big part of what happened in my teaching, but I didn't know how really. And because I didn't have the right tools to ask the questions or build the culture in which it was safe to actually give me feedback that could make things better. And as I got better at teaching, I cared about it enough. I worked hard enough that, when I started to have those conversations with students and started to see what worked, it was natural. But at the same time, I don't think I was really getting the feedback to improve myself in the way that I would want to, right? We talk a lot in education about zone of proximal development, right? Getting that challenge, getting that jump, right? Where you're not just moving incrementally, but you're actually making jumps that are challenging. Like, I wasn't able to do that because I had no mechanism for feedback. And so when I think about what we do at Pivot and how we started, is that, the importance of feedback is, if I don't ask the question, I can never know the answer. No matter how reflective, how self-aware I am as a person, as an individual, as a professional, if I don't ask my students or my colleagues, whoever is around me that can give me that feedback, I won't know. And I might think I do. And that's a really dangerous piece, right? Is I might think I know. And in reality, I don't. And it's something that it creates, it's a vulnerable place, it's a confronting place, but it's a really important place. And I think it's really interesting that you kind of, retract when you think about ed tech, because I agree. Like, I'm an educator, that's first. And then I am a CEO. But it's that way, right? And the people on my team are either educators, people that are passionate about education, or parents, right? That experience learning at a visceral level. And I think that's so important, but they're also constantly seeking feedback, whether that's what's working or not. And I think that's really important, because evidence should drive improvement. If you don't have evidence, how will you know what you need to improve on, or if it's been effective? So yeah, I think we can't underline how important this is right now, especially in a disrupted year that we've experienced. Hasn't mattered. I've talked to 40 schools over the last 3 months, and it doesn't matter if it was a school that was shut down for 3 weeks or 100 days. Every year this year every school across the country has had a similar experience of disruption and uncertainty. And that, it seems hard, but like, feedback right now, I think, is even more important. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually, now that we've done our stump speech of please do feedback, which hopefully by the end of it, you will agree with us, we're going to actually take a couple of seconds, a little bit more than a couple moments, but we're going to dig down into 2 ways to look at feedback. So Richard is going to look at it from this idea of targeted interventions that really align with the math pathway approach. And this is about really moving students along and getting them to a place of efficacy, of enjoying, math but really succeeding, right? And then I'm going to be looking at it from the point of view of a sightline of how you can create cultures of feedback where it can go from that individual classroom all the way up to system level of, like, how do you create a culture of feedback where those conversations can happen? So I'm going to put it over to Richard, and you're going to give us a lot of tips and strategies about how to do that targeted intervention.
Awesome, thank you. So look, just as a couple of extra things, I am going to use a lot of maths examples because that's what I do like every minute of my life at the moment. But to hopefully not alienate the entire group of 98 people. So I actually have a background in the humanities. So I used to teach the humanities as well as maths. I have a degree in philosophy and in ancient history. So happy to take questions about how this stuff applies outside of maths as well. I think it's very transferable. So what I'm going to talk about is a few elements of feedback. Now, we often hear as teachers, everything from the visible learning framework, the work that Hattie did years and years ago. We look at every time we look at efficacy ratings of what teachers should do in schools, in classrooms, we always hear feedback, right? Feedback is number one or it's number two. It's something to do with, this is the most effective way you can be spending your time as a teacher. But that's kind of a difficult thing as a headline, because what is feedback, right? Like, I mean, I read this, I read the visible learning strategies when I was in my teaching degree, and I was like, well, that's great. Feedback, what does that mean? At the end of a test, I tell you how I think you did? I don't know. And so rather than try and become an expert on all things feedback in like an hour, I'm going to drill into 3 specific things, each with some examples of how we think kind of collectively you might want to be doing this in your classroom. We're going to look at activities and assessment as feedback themselves, i.e. even without the teacher's intervention. We're going to look at what we think the teacher should do in feedback. Like, this is like, here's where I think you should spend your time. And we're going to look at where data is useful or not as feedback, because data is super popular in education, right? So what do we do with it? Quick background. I know there are, I've seen in the kind of chat a bunch of school names, and I see a bunch of Maths Pathway schools. So hi, if you're a Maths Pathway school, lovely to see you. If you're not, also hi. And a quick background on kind of what we do and why I talk about maths so much. So we spent the last 7 years developing what we think is the ultimate maths classroom learning and teaching model. It's a combination of technology, teaching practices, evidence-based research that essentially allow us to focus on 3 things. So we believe in very, very clearly and precisely identifying students' needs, specifically in maths, but in general, obviously. Making sure teachers have all the right pieces they need to respond to those needs. And I'm talking specifically about, well, just, my first ever year 7 class, I was given, 25, 12-year-olds and a year 7 maths textbook. This does not turn out to be a good teaching strategy. And so, part of that is us saying, well, how do you teach these very different kids appropriately? And, really is about you have the students who are the people we're trying to help, the teachers who are the people doing the helping. How do you create a loop between those 2 groups? And that is the kind of feedback that we work in. So let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about activities and assessment as feedback. Now, one of the most interesting things I learned quite late in my teaching kind of work is that, an activity that you design for students, whether it's an assessment item on a test, whether it's a project, whether it's a task that you build for them, can itself provide that student with feedback without you having to say anything. And so, a well-designed activity can highlight to the student what they know, what they don't know, and what they can and can't do, at least yet. We talk about yet a lot, right? You can't do things yet. And there are 2 kind of particular examples. Let me work you through here. One is in maths, we talk a lot about work solutions. And when we talk about work solutions, well, here's a question and here's the answer to that question. And those are actually a form of feedback if you write them well. I'll show you an example. And also for those of you maybe less in maths, but certainly in other subjects, you talk a lot about rubrics as a form of assessment. Now, I've seen a lot of awful rubrics in my time. But if they're written well, they provide a useful input to the students, which I will talk to in a second. There's been a couple of questions about, is this recording available and shared? Absolutely. So all the slide decks and the recording will be available once we're done here. So here's an example of a maths question. The maths question is, how is subtraction different to addition when you are writing number sentences? So this is a question that comes out of one of our modules. Obviously kind of around the topic, it's question 12, so it sits in a context, which you're not going to worry about at the moment. But the stuff in purple is the solution to the question. Now, when we work with students in kind of the way we expect them to learn maths, we actually take quite a different approach. So we don't say, well, the traditional way I used to teach was you'd say, okay, I have information about how to, use number sentences, for example. I will give you this information as a teacher. I will ask you to do some practice exercises, and then I will assess you to see if that information somehow connected itself into your brain, and then we're good to go. In the digital space, often I see tools that are, for example, like, well, the equivalent of that is I'm going to watch a video that shows me how to learn a thing. Then I'm going to do a bunch of practice examples, and then maybe I'm going to do a test, right? When we built the Maths Pathway way of kind of doing maths, from a feedback point of view, we actually don't while we do let kids watch videos that tell them things, we made a very intentional decision to not put that up front. So if a student in our kind of schools starts doing some work, we actually don't expect them to watch a video first. We expect them to start with a question, right? You start with the question, and then you immediately get access to what the answer to that question is. Because unlike when I was at school, I went to school in Johannesburg for background, that's the accent. I was told that looking up the answer was cheating. You had to somehow be able to do the thing without looking at the answers, right? Now that's a pretty old school view. But an answer that is usefully constructed is feedback. And this answer actually does two things for a student. One, it paints a picture of what the end goal is, right? So as a student, part of what I can do, and to be clear, this is a skill that we actually need to teach students as teachers. You have to teach them how to use a work solution. But a well-written work solution paints the picture of, here's the outcome. Like, here's the actual end goal you're heading towards. And we're going to kind of repeatedly talk around this idea that you actually can't deliver feedback in a vacuum if the student isn't working towards some form of goal already that you've set with that student, or the student has set with you. That feedback's kind of not very useful, right? And so here we have a goal, right? Obviously the goal is the answer, but now you, as a student, if I had no idea what I was doing when I started this, I now have a frame for what I'm expected to be able to explain in this question. It obviously has the actual factual information in it as well, but the way it's written, the choice of coloring, the choice of kind of, here's the arrows, here's the labeling of the arrows, kind of shows this process, right? You can even do a better job of this in a non-static version as you take students through an example, right? If you're doing a one-on-one thing, you can show them, well, here's the directionality of the arrow, here's the order in which I write things. But even if you're not doing this as a teacher, if you have activities and well-designed answers for them, and you've trained the student to, in math, for example, we always talk about, if you're doing activities, and I've got 10 questions I'm trying to answer as a student, the worst use of answers is to do the 10 and then check the answers, because your feedback is now too late. You've done 10 things, you've probably repeated the same issue 10 times. So what you actually want to do is you want to do question 1, check the answer, and we actually ask students to physically perform the activity of tick it, or cross it, or highlight it, or annotate it. Simple things. I'm sure a lot of you as teachers, what's the Australian, in South Africa we call it tipex, it's whiteout, right? We don't do whiteout in our classes because it hides information about the change you've made to the question, right? So if you try something, you cross it out, you can see the crossing out, you can see the mistake, you can see the correction. So these are kind of elements in going through this work solution system. The second thing, and again, we're going to go through this briefly because we don't have forever here, and I can talk forever about this. We talk about things like rubrics, right? So a rubric is less typically used in mathematics. We use them a lot in middle school history, which is kind of where I was teaching. A lot of rubrics are bad because they'll say things like they give either too simplistic or unclear information to the student. So the short version of a good rubric is it should be able to paint that destination picture. So as a student, I should be able to look at it and know exactly what's expected of me without asking anybody. I should not be guessing, what's in the teacher's head as to kind of how things should be done. And I think the use of rubrics. So we talk, for example, about, we do rich learning projects in mathematics, and the rich learning projects we do are about bringing in kind of mathematical discourse and discussion and context. The reason we use rubrics there is that there's no kind of single right answer to correcting that, but specifically we also make sure that the rubric itself is not covering the maths content, right? It's covering the way you approach it, and we'll come to that in a minute in terms of types of feedback and process. There's another one here, for example, like, if you're, my daughter's while pools were open, which they are not at the moment, but while they were open, my daughter was learning to swim. And, one of the things you get is this sense of, this is the swimming rubric, right? Like, you learn different things. It's clear what you're working towards and what you're doing and what you're not. So we've lost the screen. 1 minute, sorry, guys. There we go. Really, the kind of takeaway here for any kind of work that's happening in the classroom is that both of these work solutions, both rubrics, what they do is they do two things. They implicitly set a learning goal for the student, and they allow reflection on that goal. It's a really micro example of it, but if you're doing any kind of feedback, those are two elements you want. You want your goals and your reflection, because you need to know what you're aiming for, and you very much need to know what you're doing next. The second kind of element I want to talk about is the teacher's feedback. This one's really quite simple, at least as far as we see it. So the teacher's time is frankly the single most valuable component of the education system. It's also the most expensive component of the education system. Most of what we spend money on in our system is teachers, right? They are what we need. That's how we get learning done. And so we firmly believe that we should spend that time on things that are irreplaceable and things that add the most value, basically. And so what is that, right? So for us, that's a particular type of feedback. So in Maths Pathway, in our maths classes, what we do is at the end of every test, we actually, advocate for a feedback interview. But that feedback interview has two important criteria. And I think this applies to any kind of feedback discussion or interview, not just in maths, right? So it's in reference to a goal, right? So we always have a reflection on a goal that was already there. I mean, you're going to set one for the first time at some point, obviously. And B, it's not about the maths. So we actually don't advocate, if you have an assessment with a student and you're going through the feedback with them on that, the first thing you should do is not look at the content. That's our belief. Because what you're doing there is a kind of task-based feedback, which is actually kind of less generally effective, right? What we do is we call this focus on learning goals and processes, right? We use the phrase metacognitive these days, very popular. But what we talk about with the student was how do you approach whatever it was, right? So is it a task, is it a project, is it a test? How did you approach it? How did you think about it? How did you complete it? If all of those things are going well, then you can talk about the content. But I mean, these are the sort of transferable skills that we want students to be able to learn. And they're the kind of things that a computer can't give you, right? You can't get tech to tell you how well you prepared or how you thought about the problem. It's the sort of thing that really a teacher's time has to be spent doing. The one thing I want to add here is there is actually space here for what we call personal feedback as well. In a lot of feedback PD, we get told that saying things like, oh, good job, you've done well, is not good feedback. And it generally isn't. It's true. It's not especially effective by itself because it has no kind of reference to anything. The one thing it can do really well, though, is build a sense of self-efficacy and help build resilience in students, because sometimes you actually don't feel like you're doing a good job at all. And you really need someone to tell you that as part of that feedback process.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. And it's, as a former science teacher and someone that has been an academic researcher for a while, there's a really big body of research that shows that maths particularly are difficult subjects, that it can be quite difficult to be wrong. And especially for those students that are either at risk or have a perfectionist streak or are really concerned about doing their best. And so we all know that there are important years for STEM for women, where young girls tend to fall out if they are going to fall out of this work. And it tends to happen around 13 to 15 in schools. And a lot of it happens around this idea of not wanting to be wrong, to want to do your best, to really deeply believe in how important that is. And that's something as simple as identifying that it's okay to be wrong. It's actually amazing that you did this and you were challenged and you were willing to show an answer that wasn't correct, or that you did a good job on something, or that you managed to do that. Can be really great on building not just self-efficacy, but resiliency. It can build a level of comfort with discomfort. And I think it's something that I think is, like you said, Richard, it's not considered to be good feedback in the terms of it doesn't tell you what you need to do next, but it can build that sense of like, this is okay, this is good, I'm good at this. And even being wrong is actually being good, especially in novel or higher order thinking, where there isn't necessarily one right answer. So I really like that's the idea of like having that part of this, and it's not just about, it would be great if you did X, but also like the fact that you did X was really great itself.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, as teachers, it is about the personal relationship you build with students, right? And you can't be an automaton, even, and, even if there's like, here's the structure for the best type of feedback, you actually need to accept that you're talking to a human being at the same time. So let's come to, I think the one thing here, and this will connect to the challenge I'm going to issue at the end, is that this is actually not trivial. And it's easy to say, we're used to as teachers being told, oh, do this, and now do this too, do this as well, add all these elements to your practice until everything is somehow perfect. And actually, I would argue that we, frankly, as teachers, kind of waste a fair amount of time in class. I certainly used to, because I was doing things that were maybe not so valuable, maybe because other people had told me to do them. And we're going to kind of advocate for saying, well, let's see what we can take away so that we can add in the pieces that are more valuable, rather than just saying, okay, yeah, do more feedback, please, because that would be nice. So last thing, just very briefly, that I want to touch on is this idea of data as feedback. Data is super popular in the kind of talk around schools and education. Everyone talks about using data to improve learning and improve teaching and so on. Data is particularly useful if it is accurate. So the way it's measured matters a lot. If anyone wants to talk about NAPLAN later, we can do that. But it's also only useful if it leads to what next conversations, right? So I'm just going to use two examples here. One is how you use data to improve a student's process, right? So we talk about students, we just talked about, using learning process feedback to help students get better at their work. So in our classes, we grade students, in inverted commas, on three things. We grade them on the amount of growth they're making, the effort they're putting in, and the accuracy of their work. We don't issue other grades except where regulation requires us to do so. And one of the things we look at with students is, how do you improve the type of work that you're doing and your attitude to it? And so if you look even at this accuracy chart, you can almost see the conversations that happened with the teacher, right? Because students don't change their practice by themselves in general. There's a feedback loop that's taking place here. And so, while the students' kind of effort and don't worry too much about the scale here, but how the effort has oscillated over time, you can see this kind of overall trend of improvement in their accuracy. And that will be because of, and I mean, I actually know the context of this individual data, but it's because of the kind of interventions and the conversation that the teacher had in those feedback components around how that student was doing their work. And this is great data because it validates a few things. It validates to the teacher that their work is working. You're actually having an impact on the student, but also validates to the student, and in some cases, in this case, their parents as well, how they have improved, right? So you are becoming not a better student. What does that mean? You're becoming a more accurate student, which in maths particularly is very helpful. It's a domain that values accuracy hugely. And then finally, we also talk about teacher process, right? So things don't happen by magic in the classroom. They happen because the teacher does things. And one of the things we've started doing with our schools, and this is much more the work that Amanda does at Pivot, but we do this at least in a maths domain, is we look at kind of overall patterns in how students are doing. And so, here, apologies if it's a bit small, but we look at some metrics around things like students who are stuck. So we collect data around students who are stuck on various bits of maths. And in this particular class, that trend has been going down over the last 6 weeks. It's not going down by accident. It's going down because of things the teacher is doing, and is kind of looking at this information and responding to it. Similarly, we have metrics that say students with low effort or low growth are going down, but students with low accuracy is going up slightly. So, maybe as a teacher, I'm going to look at this and say, well, all right, my kids are putting more effort in, but maybe that effort is not particularly well targeted, right? They're just doing a lot of work. And so, how can I structure things so that they pay, they practice more around the attention to detail side of their work, and so on. So this is actually for us quite new work in terms of looking at providing feedback to the teacher on their actual practice and the work that they do in the classroom. It's, to go back to the beginning, it's the thing that I wanted from like the first week of being a teacher, is someone to tell me kind of, how do I do this? Or am I doing a good job, and what should I do better? And so, I think it's really exciting to be adding that in. The work that Amanda does at Pivot is really much more around this sense of, as a school as a whole, as an entity, as a teacher, and within that kind of system, how do we even approach feedback in the most kind of useful way? And so, I think that's something that you can talk to better than I can, because it's your work.
Yeah, no, I mean, so much of that resonates with me. I like even the way you started with this idea of that, the feedback in itself, right, is so important, that the task can be the feedback. And I think that that's something that we see all the time. So just for those that don't know us, we have been around for about 7 years and been working with schools across the country to identify how students perceive teaching and learning in a kind of safe, constructive way. And so what we do is we have a platform that has a student perception survey and teaching that's aligned with the ETSL framework here. And it's fully customizable. You can add questions if you're really interested in looking at creative thinking or how learning intentions are used, like whatever the area that's really important to your school or department. We have other types of feedback tools because we really believe in this evidence-driven approach to school improvement. So we have a pulse check survey tool and a couple of 360s, and we do a lot of coaching. So if you want to go to the next slide, what we're focused on is we're kind of an interesting breed of people. We're, as I mentioned before, I'm an academic researcher. I didn't finish my PhD, but I feel like this last year where we produced 2 papers in a month and a half, that I got my honorary PhD. So my grandmother can finally be happy that I did it. But we really have a strong approach of like trying to find evidence. And so this year, what we did is we actually went out in April, and you might have answered, you might be an educator that answered this survey, where we ended up with 4,000 responses from New Zealand and Australia in just 4 days about the impact of COVID-19 on teaching and learning. And so I wanted to start this from the place of, in times of disruption and times of difficulty, is feedback important? Because we often think of it as something that is a nice to have, especially at that class level. But what we actually found is when you ask this of thousands of teachers, that 90% of teachers actually wanted feedback on their teaching and learning. So 9 out of 10 teachers said, yes, I do. And 75% also was really interested on that idea of well-being or engagement. And what I wanted to say is that we often think of, if you're a school leader here, or if you're a teacher or you're a leading learner or leading teacher, is that, to get feedback into a culture, it can be quite difficult. And I absolutely agree. But I think that more than ever right now, we're in a position where teachers are actually open to that feedback in ways they've never been before. When you could not just go to your classroom and say, hey, Richard, how's it going today? And look and do a scan and see how everyone's doing. It became something that it had to be explicit, not implicit. And so what we do is really trying to create a pathway for explicit feedback to be brought in to lead to change. So if you can move to the next slide. So what we have here is like when we're thinking about the collective, right? So we've been looking at it from the point of view of the individual student, is we're going to switch it and we're going to look at a macro view. And so when we've been doing this work, the keys to that kind of building that effective feedback loop, it has to start at the top. And so that's really important. And so the first thing is it has to have this idea of like creating a strong culture of feedback, is that it's not just for students, it's for everyone. And so that means that, we don't just give feedback to students like we have like really great feedback from Math Pathways, but we actually ask students to give us feedback. We ask our peers to give feedback. We ask parents and community members. We even ask our leaders to give feedback. And because the idea is that to have a feedback culture, everyone needs to be involved, because it is a place of vulnerability. It is a place of openness to discomfort in ways that hopefully are constructive. So you has to be not just an individual teacher. We have some New Zealand guests today. Thank you for joining us. I was actually in Auckland the last time I went anywhere before the lockdown. And I was in a school in Auckland, and they are a big school. And I went into this heads of learning department meeting, and I said, like, how open are you to feedback? And they said, oh, absolutely. Yeah, we all do feedback. It's great. And I was like, okay, so you're in the math department? Okay, let's talk about the science department. Do you know what's happening in that department? No. Do you know what's happening in that other teacher's like classroom? No. But I know my classroom. And it was this idea, though, that for it to be really meaningful, it has to be common language, right? It has to be a common language of improvement, that you can be really great about getting feedback. But if it's not filtering to the larger school or the department, it becomes something that gets stopped at your classroom doors. And we know how important reflection is and collaboration is, that even just, at the best of the school, like, oh, we love feedback. If it's not cohesive and consistent, then it can be it has limited impact. So the second thing is this idea of making feedback count. And that's by asking the right questions. And so we'll go back to the idea of what Richard was saying, is that the way the question is framed in itself is a learning. If you frame who has actually taken a survey or done a test and the question was worded in a way you went, oh, wait a second, and it changed the way you were thinking about it, like maybe I should have been thinking about this all along. And I never even thought about it just the way the question was framed. And we see that all the time, is that there's nothing easier than writing a bad survey question. And I would bet if I could ask you guys to raise your hands, if I could see you, that somewhere here has either answered a bad survey question this year or written one. And, so because you can have too many things going, not clear language, or the end of, someone raised a hand, thank you. I don't know which size it was, but definitely has happened. And it's the idea of like how important it is to have the right questions. And one of the things that we work so hard on at Pivot is like, what are those right questions and when are they done? And when you think about feedback, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, is that for it to count, it has to have meaning. And I'm going to piggyback on what you said, Richard. Like, it's that data only matters if it means next steps or action or change. Otherwise, it's just another piece of data that sits in a room somewhere, or your head, like in your, and it doesn't go anywhere. So that's really important. And then the third thing is that it should be the starting point for dialogue, not the end. And I mean this very, very sincerely. Oftentimes what we will do is we will ask for feedback. We will get the feedback, and that will be it. I don't know about you, but I've done plenty of surveys where, I thought, okay, I'm going to give feedback. It's going to be great. And then it goes into the black hole of the survey, like a survey graveyard. I mean, this year alone, we probably have like thousands of surveys living in that graveyard. And someone looked at it, we assume, right? You assume it was looked at, but you don't know. And maybe there was change, but you can't identify where the changes happened, what was the impetus, if it was actually what you responded to. And I have a little bit of a bailiwick. Some of our research has been used in a way where it was cited, but it wasn't actually used effectively, meaning that the outcome was not what our outcome that the data showed was not what was used. And it's one of those things where you can see that happening, where data can be manipulated or it could be used in ways that are for an agenda. And we definitely don't want that to be the thing, and the way that you can get around that is by actually talking about the data and going back and playing back those results. And then having those conversations, you can actually get to the meat of it, of what actually was meant in that response. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide. So we're going to talk about this thing I've been talking about a lot with schools around Australia, and is this idea of a common language approach to improvement. And so what I really want to impart, if there's one thing I can leave you with today, is that not only am I enthusiastic about this work, because you probably already know, but is this idea of like, you can come together with students and staff and families and have a common language for what school improvement looks like in your school. And I think that we can say with all fidelity that every teacher or educator in here can improve something within their practice, within their school, within their community. And it's so much easier to do that when it's something that is a collaborative approach, meaning that it's not, you don't have to, as a teacher, be the best and change everything. What you need to do is you need to partner with the right people at the right time. So we have a continuum, and actually one of the people from my team is going to share a one-pager that we've created that has this and a couple of examples of how to do this in your school, of this continuum. And I talk about this a lot, and it's the idea of moving from what tends to happen with feedback all the way until the best ways we've ever seen it. And so first thing is the idea of feedback and reflection. So whether you use our survey or another tool, it's this idea of once you get the feedback, actually taking the time to look at it, right? Is to go in, identify your own self-perceptions, and it's really important. It's an important part. We know the research shows that reflective practice is an amazing indicator of teacher efficacy and student outcomes. But the idea here is that this is often where we end. It stops here. And we see that in our own work that, 75% of teachers learn something new about themselves from the pivot survey, but more than like 90% learn something they already knew. It just reinforced something. And because students are really accurate at providing feedback, it's always a surprise. Everyone's like, oh, but my students won't know. And then your students do know. They can tell if you got a new haircut, a new watch, bad day, sunburn. They can also tell you if you're actually assessing them correctly. And so I think that that is really important. So if it's your school that's maybe not open yet to this idea of this really collaborative approach, start here, do it, and give time for reflection. But if you're ready to actually move down the continuum, the next idea is that feedback and conversation. So this is where you go back to those that gave you feedback and have that conversation. So I saw that, Richard, it's really great to get your feedback. So you said that I was really good at challenging you with goal setting. Can you give me an example of when I gave you a challenging goal and have that conversation? But I also noticed that one of the items that I don't do particularly well is keeping you interested and engaged in the classroom. So what I want to talk about is we're going to look at this. Where are the most engaging times that we have together? Okay, awesome. And where are the times that you're not engaged? And we're just going to, and it's a safe space and it's okay. I know that I'm not the most interesting teacher in the world, but we're going to have that conversation and I hope to improve based on it. We find more than anything else, and this is so funny because it takes 10 minutes to do this, is you will have, as an educator or a leader, the most informative, eye-opening conversation with your students by taking this time. Because what you might realize, what we've seen in our data, when someone said, oh, I find this class doesn't keep my attention. What we found is that when students were doing in that classroom or doing group work, they didn't actually think it was learning. So even though they had a great time, they were super attentive, it was really engaging, they did not actually think that was real learning. And so they completely threw it out. They're like, oh, but no, like learning is lecture, or the videos that Richard was talking about, at that point, the teacher was able to actually dig in and say, I'm glad you enjoy this, but this is learning and this is how. And I want you now to reflect on this and look for it yourselves. And that really can be pretty amazing. So that's number 2. Then if you really want to go all in, it's that feedback and action. And what I suggest here is it not just your action. It's not just me as teacher or educator or leader, but it's feedback and action with a partnership model. So if it's at the classroom level or it's at the school level or it's at the department level, that you're actually working together to make change. So you're committing together, because every classroom is an ecosystem. Every school is an ecosystem. It's not closed. Things come in and out. It can be quite messy. There's a lot of energy transfer. It's something that's quite interesting, right? But it is something that if you can, if let's talk about going back to engaging classroom, work with the students, have them actually tell you, give you like a look for like observations of how much time that they were engaged in that lesson. And then at the end, you have a tally as that my students are engaged 50% of the time. Okay, I need to go back to that lesson and figure out what's going wrong. And then my best lesson's 90. And so what are the differences there? And actually work together. Or we're going to make a commitment that if you do not feel challenged, there's going to be a safe way for you to tell me that. And we're actually going to work together to challenge you. And what we are seeing across our data set this year is that with the disruption of COVID-19, there are 2 things happening. Number 1 is that students aren't feeling challenged at the same level as they used to, and they're not feeling engaged at the same level they're used to. And that is something that is probably we can recognize in ourselves, right? We're all trying to survive. We're not really proactively able to meet and exceed, our goals. And I think that's really important. But you can work with your students. We've seen this over and over again, that you can work with your students or staff to actually come together as a group to make that change. And having an accountability buddy or an accountability classroom, it's just really makes it a lot easier to make sure that it actually happens, that you don't get torn away where we're like, oh, I'm going to really focus on challenging goal setting. And then I get pulled by my administrator or a parent or that kid, and I get away from it, right? That students will remind you and pull you back to, this is going to be our goal. We're not going to do it great every day, but we're really going to focus on it this term. So that's our goal, like this idea of the feedback continuum. And we see this happen at schools. And like I said, it's doing the first is really important. If you can take it outside of yourself, look at it in conversation, and then do it together as a partnership in action. It's really where you see building that common language approach to improving your practice or your school. So I wanted to end. I had a coaching session recently with a school. So if we can move to the next slide. And it's a little bit of a case study, although it looks like the images didn't show up, but that's okay. Can we go back to they should be there. But I had a conversation today with a senior school. And the senior school had really good results in the pivot survey. Students were agreeing across the board. And what we were like, oh, it feels pretty good, but let's actually like dig a little bit deeper. So we dug a little bit deeper. And what we found is that when we looked at the results, just based on year levels, that it was really like students had the same experience. They were all feeling pretty good. They were agreeing that teachers were doing a good job. And it was pretty great. And let's see, yeah, so here you can see, like, so the school average is that orange, and then year 11 and year 12. And so if you have this here, right, you can see it's a really tight grouping, right, that 11th and 12th graders are having the same experience. But then I was like, okay, let's look at it from the department view. And if we can switch to the next slide, what we'll see is that red line is the average. And what you're going to see right here is that out of a 5-point scale is students are actually not having the same experience. We're seeing an incredible distance between departments where you have departments that are doing above average by a good margin, but then you have more than half of your departments below average across the board. And even though from that first view looks pretty good, right? Everyone's doing pretty well. What you can actually see here is that within this school, so 1,200 student school, the variance and the difference between departments is enormous. And this is a place of conversation. And this is where data and feedback can be so important, is that, it isn't necessarily the same for everyone. But what you can see if you look at it the right way, you ask the right questions and you dig deep enough, is you can actually have a better understanding of what's really happening. And then now this school has committed to going back and looking at this as a common language approach and actually talking about why things are so different and how they're going to work with the students to identify how to improve these practices and how they're going to work together as different departments to actually share and embed best practices. And so I think that it's really remarkable. It's just one school, and it's all different, but it's just those asking the right question and interrogating it and then doing the next step.
It's so interesting as well because, we hear in a lot of other literature that if you look at the differences in like results or performance or student outcomes, actually the differences inside a given school are generally bigger than the differences between two random schools that you pick around the country, right? So on average, kids perform quite evenly. But this is such an interesting example of how, as a teacher, it's, so I remember finding this it's really quite confronting to realize that maybe you kind of always know, certainly when I was a new teacher, I knew there were far better teachers than I was because, you saw them in their classrooms and they were amazing. But I think this idea of creating a safe space to talk about that, to say, well, maybe I'm not doing as well on some of this stuff and what does that look like and how can I constructively improve? And what I like about this is it's not about, I see the people from all different types of states here, and I'm familiar with some of the state structural systems. And I think there's a big difference when it's analysis of performance that comes from on high, that comes from like an external auditor or some kind of process like that. But there's a difference then if it comes from, your own kind of safe environment, your students, your peers that you feel a bit more trust for. I think, yeah, it's super, super cool. I would have loved this as a teacher.
I mean, it's interesting. We just got a question from Marcella, which is great, about this idea is, could it be differences between departments, whether students like or dislike subjects? And so, there are lots of ways that students actually provide feedback, but what you'll see here, this is multiple classrooms, multiple teachers, this is multiple types of courses. And if you like what we see almost across the board here is that this is this is trend data, right? That it's not just, there's English and math and pathways and like all below, right? And then science and humanities are above in this example, right? And in some of those places, though, we'll see the exact opposite. And it really, when you ask that teacher, though, or that department head or that learning leader, they almost always can pinpoint what it is. And it's not, it is usually much more about how new the teachers are, if if the teachers have a lot of preps, if they're not specialists, if they don't have any common planning time, if students are, if there's a level of disconnect happening in certain areas. And it's really pretty fascinating that I think we always think about popularity contests when it comes to feedback like this or data. And what we find more and more is that when it's a safe space, meaning this is fully anonymous, students are fully anonymous, and the teachers' results are confidential to them, is that what it does is it actually, like, it's not about popularity. It's not a question like, Richard, I like Richard's class. It's much more about, does he push me to set challenging goals? Does he ask me to explain my answers? Does he show respect for me? And those are about the teaching practices and the conditions of good teaching. And that we really don't see that popularity piece. We see much more, this is an indication of what's not working. And that it often comes down to structural issues or curriculum issues or timing or planning, et cetera. And we see that happen quite a bit. Great. So we're gonna end, and thank you guys for keeping with us from our conversation. So we're going to have a session now about challenges. And so this was something that Rich and I were talking about when we were prepping for this presentation, of how important it is that you take away something and you have something to bring back with you. So we're going to start with challenges to the teachers that are listening today, and then I'll do one for our school leaders.
So this is a simple one, based on the idea that it's fine to have all this great stuff and opportunities, but when do we kind of do it in practice? This is an exercise that I did very late in my teaching career, on the back of the advice of a mentor of mine, and it was really interesting. It's done kind of in some companies and so on as well, but the challenge here is to do this. So examine the time you're spending in the classroom, and if you can, actually examine it, right? So this is much easier when someone else is watching you, because they can write it down for you. So if you get the chance to have someone observe your class, have them note, in a couple of categories, like, what are you doing? Oh, you spent 5 minutes doing introduction. You spent 3 minutes getting the kids to sit down, or 35 minutes getting the kids to sit down in some of my classes. And the kind of, what are the different elements? Well, here's where you did some feedback. Here's where you did some instruction. And take a look at that data and use it to get a sense. You might already have a good sense yourself. Are you making the most of your value as a teacher, right? We're not automata. We know these days we're not content deliverers. We don't have as much information as the rest of the universe can ever have for our students. And so, do you feel that your time in the classroom is spent well? And if not, then the kind of one thing I would pick on is, like, pick something you don't like and take it out. You probably won't get in trouble for it, because it's your classroom and you're in control. And what I would suggest is take it out and replace it with one of these process-based feedback conversations. And so, the example that Amanda had, for example, of if you have any information about your own practice, that's a great time to talk about it with your students, or to run a quick question and answer sort of activity. Certainly, if you're in a maths pathway school, I really hope you're already doing these. But to kind of to look at that as an opportunity to kind of fill in that space. And exactly as Amanda was saying, if you've already, like, no, I do feedback, we have conversations, that's great. Maybe look at taking the next step in that continuum to be able to say, all right, well, let's broaden that, or frankly, help another colleague to do that, right? If you're doing a fantastic, do you feel like, yeah, I get a lot of good feedback, I'm doing a fantastic job, find someone who is struggling or would kind of feel like, hey, I could do with some useful feedback. Certainly that was me in my early years. I would have loved someone to walk up to me and be like, hey, you know what? Do you want me to help you sort this out? That'd be great. And help them to kind of improve that quality. Yeah, that's my challenge.
That's great. I love that. And I agree. Like, we have, it's always great when someone's like, oh, I'd love to be able to support you on this thing. Right. And we see that happen all the time in our platform with our peer observations. So from the perspective of the school leader, or, even an educator too, that has a lot of really large focus on this idea of building this evidence-based culture of feedback is that, the one thing that I would say is if you're a leader here, I would suggest, like, if you can go back and make a commitment to sharing feedback, whatever it is. It could be a survey, it could be some conversations you've had, but actually sharing feedback with your whole school community. And it seems kind of silly, right? Because you're like, oh, of course we always do this. But when is the last time that you got feedback and you shared it in like with everyone? And how did you do it? And it's, if you haven't done it lately, if it has been something where you've gotten this, you pulled it in, you've looked at it, but it hasn't gone further than your leadership team or even your desk. What I want to do is challenge you to feed it back to your community. So that's one. The second is, I think this is so fascinating. Like, we're so busy, but this idea of just taking time, I'm going to say with Richard, if you can take out one thing from your week and you get 10 minutes back, I don't know if you can, apologies if you can't, maybe, maybe that cup of coffee is on the go, but it's the idea of actually taking, in this term, just talk to a couple students and a couple teachers each week until the end of the term. And that's just a conversation. How's it going? What are you, what is, how has this year been for you? What's working? What's not working? Is there anything I can do to help? Informal conversations, informal feedback. But then what it's going to happen is that you're going to start building this, from leading from the top of building that collaborative culture, is that you're going to have the opportunity now that teachers and students are going to be like, oh, like the principal or this domain leader actually came and asked me how it was going and what was working. And then if they start to see that's common, and then if it can be played back to them again in that conversation, that continuum can be really powerful. And the last thing is, what I suggest is model that feedback from the top. And that means that you being open as a leader to feedback. So that's your practice. And it doesn't have to be on everything, but it could be something, an area of focus. If you really worked really hard this year to do your best for the well-being of your staff or students, or you wanted to, with the crisis happening all around us, you were really, really focused on the instructional delivery online. And that was a big area of focus for you and a goal. What I would suggest is actually go out. We can, we can help you, or someone can help you design a very simple feedback tool. Get that feedback, then do it. You're pulling it all together, right? Share it with your community. So I got this feedback of this thing. This is how it was. And then I'm going to commit to this one change. And this is probably the most important thing I'll leave this with, this conversation with, is that when we try to change everything, we change nothing. And so it's just really important to be really targeted and pick a thing to do, but really believe that it's going to change your practice. It's built on evidence. Like, someone has told you this is, or many people have told you this is an area for improvement, and then go off and do it. And then keep getting that feedback, keep trying, because that's really going to be a model for your students. It'll be a model for your teachers. It'll be a model for your staff, your community. And that's really what we want, right? Because then when you go in and say, we're going to start doing feedback as a common language for improvement, they can see that you're already involved and you're already open to it, and that there's a reason for them to meet you and to be potentially a little bit vulnerable, a little bit open. And I think that will be, it sounds like, it might sound like a lot, and so you don't have to do it all, but even if you just do one of these things this year, it would be really great to start building that culture for next year. So that's our major part of the conversation. So we're going to take a couple minutes for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer them. So I think the first question is from Katie, which is this idea of sharing a copy of the survey that was implemented. And so, yeah, we're happy, Katie, if you want to send me an email, I'm going to put my email in the chat. We're happy to provide you the questions and how this is done. So feel free to email me about that. But if you have any questions about what we talked about today, please put them in. And then I'm going to ask a question of Richard. So if you can have one type of feedback about your own practice, being like you as educator and CEO, what kind of feedback is most important to you?
So that's a good one. I actually, as Maths Pathways has gotten bigger, I've noticed that my job has turned less into kind of building and delivering things. You know, I used to like sit there and write code. But these days it's more about, you know, I have a team of 30 people at Maths Pathway, mostly ex-teachers and obviously great passionate educators. But actually it's really my feedback that I always want is, how am I looking after my people in the organization? How am I supporting them? I mean, you know, we had to transition, like a lot of people, to working from home. We had 30 people on Zoom calls all the time. And we always prided ourselves in the culture in our organization, right? Inside our company. Mostly because I used to work in a bunch of places with terrible culture. And so I was like, I really want to look after our people. And so how do we do that? And it's funny, actually. So, you know, just on that, we actually have a process for collecting that feedback. Every 2 weeks, we run a happiness survey. That's less terrible than it sounds, I promise. But we ask people, you know, we say to them, like, what, if you could rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel this fortnight? How do you rate the company, Maths Pathway, on a scale of 1 to 5? And what one thing would make you happier in the next fortnight? And we collect that information every 2 weeks, and we act on that information. And sometimes we can, because it's like, oh, I want more coffee for the office. And sometimes it's, well, I want lockdown to end. And so, you know, we can do some things and we can't do some things. But, you know, that feedback in terms of how we're doing as an organization, and like the things we have in place for our people is so helpful, because, you know, I can't read people's minds, but I really want, you know, us to be doing a good job. So I think, like, to be honest, if we implemented that sort of stuff in schools and in classrooms, you know, I think I've seen schools that are run really well with leaders who care a lot about their staff, and that's amazing. And I've seen it not done so well. And so I think, you know, listening to feedback from students and from staff about what they're doing and what they need to do their jobs well would be a great step, right, for a lot of places. So.
Yeah, no, and I agree about that a lot. I think it's even the action of asking for that type of feedback is in itself empowering. And if you can show that like, if you can in lockdown, Richard, I'm surprised. It feels like you would be able to, but you know, this idea of the small incremental wins can be huge. The same way we talked about that self-efficacy piece. Like, we find that we ask these questions, students are actually much more attuned to that practice being important the next time. We actually see some of our items, the averages fall, because they now know what to look for, and they now know it's important, and they now have the words in which to look for that thing. And it seems kind of funny, because you're like, oh, you know, we have this moment of like, we want to fix everything. It's, you know, I start my coaching calls by saying, we all want to go to the things to improve, but actually let's come back up. Like, what is there to celebrate? And what is there to show that the feedback in itself is important, that there are things to win? And I think that that's really, really, really important. And we see that Tina said something in the chat about like, that's this idea of not just supporting teachers when there's a problem, but exactly when things are going well. And I mean, it's so, I see it all the time. Like, you know, we miss the good stuff. We don't celebrate it. We don't make a big deal over the good stuff. It's always the things we need to fix. It's never like, I mean, go crazy, like have a party when you get something back and all kids like just had a good day. Like, we just had a good day, guys. It was a great day, you know, and it sounds silly, but like those types of things are just as important as when someone improves or someone is, like, there's a level of challenge that has to be met. And I think that that's a really big part of how you start to shift that culture within schools to be more open to feedback. And so from Adam, we have a question. Do you have any suggested resources around like that could serve as a process for giving feedback to a teacher who's keen to improve? So that's a good question. I don't know if, Richard, do you feel comfortable answering that? I could definitely, if not.
I mean, look, we a lot of the things we do, and you know, we'll probably put together a pack of stuff to send around to everyone afterwards. I think it's probably the easiest way. I, you know, seen a few items in the chat about people wanting copies of various things. So certainly we have a bunch of kind of recommended practices on kind of feedback processes. So we have a kind of a structure of you know, how we think effective classrooms look and run, and there are some tools in there around digging into you know, the kind of helpful pieces and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think we can include those. Amanda, I don't know if you have any like standout. I will actually add. So I'll add one thing that's not even teaching specific. If you want like I always do, I like to like recommend things to read because I love reading. If I had to recommend one reading on feedback, it's actually not from education at all. It's a book called Radical Candor, written by a woman, I think Kim Scott was the woman who wrote it. We practiced it internally in Maths Pathway, and basically what it taught, a lot of it feels like common sense after you've read it, which I feel like is always a good thing for a book. But you know, it talks about practices and processes and templates for how you deliver and seek feedback in a way that is what they call radically candid. So it combines, it avoids what they call, so at Maths Pathway, we used to, because I come from a background of working in companies that have pretty crappy cultures, I kind of went too far in the other direction for a while, and we suffered from what the book calls ruinous empathy, which is a nice way of saying you're just being too nice to each other and nobody ever asks challenging questions. But what it avoids is the whole idea of the other quadrant of problematic, which is what they call obnoxious aggression, which is when everyone's angry at each other all the time. And so, you know, radical candor is the bit in the middle. And so, yeah, I really couldn't recommend that highly enough. I read it a couple of times, and we've implemented a bunch of the practices in our organization. But yeah, I think, you know, we can add that into a pack at the end as well.
Yeah, that's really great. And as far as when you have like the conversations, and we have some resources as well if you want, we can follow up with, is this idea of you know, there's really great research around setting up feedback structures in ways in which feel constructive, and, you know, taking a coaching model instead of a prescriptive or a punitive model. That's really important, is that, you know, if a teacher is keen to improve or may need some prompting to help improve, is that having that be a discussion, a coaching conversation where you don't come in with your head of what the answer is. Because the idea here is that, like, I often will say, okay, Richard, you need to improve on something, and here's how you need to improve, and this is how it'll go. Like that kind of structure is actually really ineffective, because I don't know what the answer is because it's not me. And so I might see a behavior, I see the external, right? I don't see necessarily, I might see a stimuli that causes a behavior, and then I see the behavior, but I don't actually understand what's happening. And I don't understand what the right way to redirect that is until I have a conversation with that person. And so it's really important to come with a question, right? The framework is come with a question, come with a couple of examples of when you have seen or observed this behavior, and then have a conversation about the why. And to be honest, that person might not be ready to have that conversation about the why yet. But once they are, then talk about how to improve, and then put into place ways in which you can support that improvement. That kind of approach works really well, whether it's with someone that's very keen or not. And so, because it really allows it not to be about the person giving feedback, but the person that is receiving it, which is really important. So it looks like that's all of our question and answer. And thank you all for staying with us. I want to say this is kind of, this come together pretty quickly. We were talking just about a month and a half ago, and now we had over 100 people hanging out with us on their Thursday afternoon. We're really excited. It was a pleasure to get to meet Richard, to learn more about Math Pathways and the work that you all do. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all today around feedback. We're here, like, I think I can say, just even from this moment of having met Richard in this manner, is that we're both pretty open to wanting to be better as organizations, as products, as platforms. So please feel free to reach out. I have my email address. You know, if you have some questions, it'd be great to hear from you.
Yep, absolutely, ditto. Thank you all. Your time is super valuable, so thanks for spending it here. We'll send out the recording. We'll send out follow-up information, and yeah, have a wonderful, safe, happy rest of the week. And we might see you around at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day. And if you're in Melbourne, go enjoy a coffee or a beer or whatever makes you happy.
Or go to Bunnings. That works too. That's all.
Or Kmart.
Exactly.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you all. Cheers.